Hi guys, in this video we're going to be talking all about the late 19th century architecture and how it unfolded into what would become the 20th century style of architecture, which is pretty known all around the world. It's interesting because it all has its roots back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So right now, right here, the slide that you're looking at is the Marshall Field's wholesale store in Chicago, and the new architecture was developed at this time, and this was created around 1885 to 1887, so it's the late 19th century. It was developed to accommodate the needs of a modern urban area. Um, One of the things that was happening is more and more people were moving into the city. The square footage of the space on the ground in the city was becoming more and more expensive. And so buying and creating big buildings that sprawled for a whole block or for multiple blocks or whatever just wasn't practical because it was so expensive to build in the city. And so the only way that made sense was to go up, and up they did go. Um, and it's interesting because if you look at this particular building, you can see that it actually looks a little bit neoclassical in its style. It looks a little bit like the Renaissance palazzos in some ways, right? Um, and the neoclassical or styles that were favored um, by the schools of art, although they kind of used the style a little bit, they weren't, the industry needed them to be more. Large buildings were needed for commerce, transportation, storage, and manufacturing. Large, but ones that didn't occupy too much ground space. So this door, so just looking at it, I want you to think about how it resembles a palazzo created during the Renaissance. You can think back to the Medici Riccardi Palazzo that we saw in Florence, or the Palazzo Rucellai. And you can see that they used the same kind of stone facing and the arcaded windows. You can see that they also changed the style from floor to floor, and it got a little bit lighter and smaller as it went up, just the way the palazzos did too. So it was right around this time that steel, the alloy steel, was invented. It was strong, it was cheap, it resisted rust, and it was much lighter than iron. And it was quickly adopted as the preferred building material for the inner skeleton of these new city buildings. The other invention that happened right around this time, and here I'll show you this slide, was the elevator. And you can see the inner structure of the steel, in kind of in skeleton that lies underneath the outer structure of the building. And then of course there would be inside the building shafts for the elevator, for plumbing, for electric, for ventilation, and all of that kind of stuff too. Um, uh, the elevator was first invented and manufactured in 1889. And with the advent of the elevator, it was possible to build a really tall building that could go way high, as high as the structure, the steel could support it, because you didn't need to walk up and down all those stairs to get there. All right, let's keep going on. This is the Wainwright building, created by Louis Sullivan. And we'll stop here and talk about this building as a real early precursor of the modern skyscraper. And I like to use this one because it's pretty tall, and it also has both some classical elements and some real clean elements of this style that came out of Chicago. So this Chicago style, this is a little bit later building than the Marshall Field store that we saw, but it has a lot of the same elements. So this one was designed by Louis Sullivan, and he's he's kind of carrying on Henry Richardson's design that looks a little palazzo-like and has these different levels, and that each different level has a different use, which is interesting. They developed a unique look, one that combined symmetry and balance and a kind of streamlined utilitarian urban look. Sullivan was one of the first U.S. trained architects to work in the United States. He was trained by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he wanted to break from historical styles and develop the first modern and what he called skyscraper. So they coined the term. The Wainwright building featured a bottom floor with large windows, as you can see down here by the cars. Of course, when he built it, it didn't look like that. And that bottom floor was exclusively meant, just like the Marshall Field store, for retail. Big windows so that people could walk by and look inside the window. But you can see the Marshall Field store, the Wainwright building was really set up for retail. Large picture windows where people could display goods. And then stores in a U-shaped interior where offices surrounded an interior atrium. So that's very palazzo-like, right? So that inside the interior offices in the building wouldn't be all dark by having this open middle section. Even in the center part of the building, you'd get some light. The exterior reflects the purpose of each floor, following Sullivan's rule that form should follow function. So form follows function. So things needed to be built the way they were going to be used. And this purpose fulfilled the concept for the design, became the new architectural credo. This building is not all about function, however. So some of the architectural elements that aren't very functional but are still there are really decorative. Like, for instance, if you look at the very top of the building, you can see this decorative frieze, which has been built at the top to kind of disguise the floor, where all of the heating and cooling devices, that all of the inner workings of the building lived up there at the very top of the building, and it was made to look almost like a Art Nouveau-ish kind of classical frieze up at the top at this entablature. But the ways that it did follow function, form following function, is the bottom floor, of course, would be the retail. The next level would be the storage for the retail. And then above that would be all the offices for either the executives who worked in the retail store or other rental offices that other executives would purchase. All right, moving on. Now we're getting to, this is the building that is on the AP for this period, and now we're moving across the turn of the century. This is the Carson Peary Scott and Company building. It was also built in Chicago, so this is one of the reasons why this architectural style and boom was called the Chicago style. It was built by Louis Sullivan, again, who also built the Wainwright building that we just looked at. And it was this company was like a department store, a retailer. And you can totally see that, right? As you see the bottom part of the building, and this is in a contemporary photograph of the building, you can see that the bottom windows are, the bottom two floors, the windows are huge and full of merchandise to attract shoppers who are walking by so that they can look and do look at the window shopping. So this was built in Chicago a little less than 10 years after the Wainwright building. And you can see that it's also a lot more decorative in a lot of ways. First of all, he decided not to go quite so high. It's not quite as high, it's a little bit more spread out, which is kind of interesting. And let's look at some of the decorative elements. I'm gonna actually take you through some of these slides. So this, you can see, well, one of the first things you might notice is that instead of having really clean, squared off edges, this building is much more rounded and is reflecting that more natural, return to naturalism that was influenced by the Art Nouveau movement. And you can also see that this main entrance to the building, which is in the corner, is kind of interesting and innovative because it not only allows people to enter on one side of the block, but also on the other side of the block as well. And across the street, it also makes the building look really inviting. And so it's a super elegant design that really works hard to capture, to attract the interest of shoppers and invite them in. And as we go along, you can see that there's a lot of really gorgeous decorative metalwork that happens all along and surrounding the big glass windows on both floors. And all of this gorgeous detailing done in that Art Nouveau style were done in cast iron, and that we had both the big windows and these detailed transom windows above that. And then as you go, actually, I've got one more really good slide. This is the main entrance with the three revolving doors on all three sides of this rounded corner, so you could enter on either side of the block and on the corner, which is beautiful. Also, we have really beautiful white terracotta detailing in the upper floors around the windows. It's really, really pretty window details, as decorative window treatments, including a big picture window flanked by two narrow side windows, which were called, also this style of window was called the Chicago window, which is beautiful. And at the very top, I'll go back to this one to see that. You can see that they have a very large cornice that spreads out over the whole top of the rest of the building, kind of giving it a really nice polished end look to the top of the building. Okay, and as I mentioned, the big stylistic influencer at the time was the Art Nouveau style, which was really kind of reacting against the super clean, hard manufacturing look of early modernism, and with a little bit of a trend back towards incorporating nature. And let's go. So not only was it really decorative, I'm going to take it a few more slides in. Here we go. But we're looking at the floor plan now. But it was really, really, really practical. It's kind of interesting. So here's the floor plan. And one of the first things you might notice about the floor plan is that it's pretty open. So you guys are used to looking at floor plans, right? What are these little things? All right, I'm going to tell you. They're pillars. And these would be the stainless steel, the steel pillars that would be the infrastructure of the whole building, that would hold the whole building up from bottom up. And so these would be the pieces that would run through every single floor. But I want to ask you a question about this. So here it is. Here's the basic bottom floor. And every floor would be more or less like this, right? So as we're looking, you can see that the bottom floor bottom two floors are made for the retail, the commercial retail department store. But above that would be offices that were either for the department store or for other rental offices. So all this space above this big open department store would be rented out and would make revenue for the owners of the building. But let's go back now here. But every floor looks just like this. Why did they do it this way? What are you noticing about it? What could they do with each floor if it was built like this? And this was the genius of this building. Not only did it have this beautiful style and this very cohesive look that kind of differentiated each level for its own particular function, but on each floor, it was built in this same exact way. And one of the things you might be noticing is that it looks a lot like a skeleton. Yeah. So I want you to answer me this. Why did they build it like this? Why does it look so empty in here? Pretend you're on the floor with the department store. How would they fill it out? How would they make it look? Would it always look like this? Like the way that they designed it the first time? Now move up 4 floors, go into an office building. Now how did it look? And would it always look that way? So I want you to answer me, why did they leave it so open like this? And how, what did that give them? What did that give the owners of the building? Did it afford them? It's super incredibly functional. So hopefully you figured this out. Maybe you'll look at your colleagues' writings to help figure it out. Definitely listening to the videotape will help you figure it out, reading about it. So Sullivan wanted to make his building stand out as distinct from all others in the city, which is why he kind of shifted away from the pure form, form should follow function thing, and he gave this building a beautiful decorative quality. And though Sullivan was very much into the skyscraper, this building has a much more horizontal orientation. But he knew this building had to function for its clients. And so you're going to tell me how this floor plan really helped it function. Okay, we're going to move on to the next piece of architecture. So you guys might remember this. This was the Bauhaus building of Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer. These guys were the designers that came after World War II and wanted after World War I wanted to design really clean, functional architecture, and from that came Le Corbusier, who was a French designer and such an interesting character. And this is his very famous Villa Savoy, just outside of Paris, France. And this building is not unlike the Bauhaus building or the Peary Scott and Company, Carson, Peary Scott and Company building. This was not a commercial building. This building is a home, which is interesting. This is a private home, and it followed the principles of this international style that was formed by the Bauhaus, as well as Le Corbusier's purist ideal. So the architect is named Le Corbusier, which was I guess a nickname. It was what he went by, and it just basically means the raven. That's how he liked to be known. And Le Corbusier felt that houses should be simple, no decoration. He thought that a house should be a machine for living in. And as you can see, his machine for living looks quite a lot like a floating box. You'll see that you notice that the entire home is lifted off the ground on steel posts. And he thought that architecture should be really modern and clean and functional, but it shouldn't abandon its classical, its very classical roots. And so and I think it's hard to see its classical roots in here. So let's just hang on to that thought that he wanted it to hang on to its classical roots. He developed a system of architecture called his 5 points of architecture, and he felt that all buildings should have all 5 of these. He thought that they should all have some slender columns that raise the house off the ground to allow air to circulate. He also thought, here I'm going to move us around a little bit. So here's another view of the columns. And you can see that there's actually, it's not completely floating. There's a ground level, but it's been painted in such a way to disguise it, actually. And he also felt that it should have rooftop terrace so that you can invite the nature inside the house. So this house not only has a rooftop terrace, which is really kind of a lovely garden area where you could hang out, but it also has a kind of an atrium level as well that's inside the main living area of the house. It should have a free-form floor plan that could be adjusted to the needs of the resident. So let's take a look at that. That's a model. And you can see here's the floor plan. There's the bottom level that's painted and kind of disguised, and here's the main level, and then the rooftop terrace. And one of the things he thought that the floor plan should have as few solid stationary walls as possible, as only the ones that were needed for structure, and that any other interior walls should all be sliding walls so that the person living in the building could move them around to suit their needs. So he really thought that the house should accommodate whoever was living there. And the same thing with the facade. He thought that the facade should be really, really simple, so that it could be open to the decoration or the experimentation of the residents. So it should be kind of a blank canvas upon which the resident, the person living there, could decorate it. And he also innovated an interesting form of window. We've seen lots of different kinds of windows, but this real strip of windows, it almost looks like a film strip. He called this ribbon windows. And he thought that they added to the simplicity and the lack of decoration, but still let in a great deal of light. So this also followed his form. So he had this idea of using a very basic building block, and that's been around since classical times. But he thought this would be a different kind of block. He hoped that homes would be more functional and that different elements could be moved or ordered as the occupants might need. And like I was saying, and I'm going to show you the interior space here. So here's the inside, and this is the very bottom. You can see that this is underneath where the pillars would be outside. And you can see that unlike the outside, which is so boxy, the inside is not, actually. So how is the interior? Take a look at the rest of these slides. Oops, not that one. Yeah, how is the interior space a little bit different from the exterior space? And looking at this, I want you to answer me this question. What was from what you can see from your reading and listening to Khan Academy about Le Corbusier and the Villa Savoye, what did he believe about the way people should live in a house in terms of interior and exterior spaces? What did he think should be true about the way we lived around interior and exterior? He had kind of had really interesting ideas. So answer that question. You're going to be talking about the difference between the interior and the exterior and what his beliefs and how that demonstrates his belief of what the interior space should be like and the exterior space for living for people. What did he think what was the healthiest way that Le Corbusier thought we should all live? One of the other things that's really interesting, Le Corbusier was really well ahead of his time in inventing other things. He believed he was the first guy who came up with the whole grid idea of the suburb. He thought that there should be urban living units with multiple houses but spread out, that had their own yards, that also had their close by shopping and had their close by schools. This was his design, and it eventually became reality all across the United States and other areas of the world in the form of suburbs, which are now, of course, a cliche. But back then, there was no such thing, and so it was a kind of it was a new thing when he came up with it. And we're just going to show you one last piece that Le Corbusier designed, and this is called Notre Dame d'Eau, or Our Lady of the Heights, of Our High Lady. And this was a church that he designed in the 1950s, so quite a lot later. And as you can see, he abandoned that really super simple pared down style of the Villa Savoye to create a piece of architecture that had a lot more symbolism and shape based on the significance or the meaning of the building. You might notice that it doesn't look very church-like. It almost looks like a boat or something like that, like a ship, or with sails billowing out or something like that. Um, and I'm going to show you the interior space really quickly, which is super interesting because it's got all these really deep walls and these very thin windows that have light that just pierces through it, and it gives it this incredibly solemn look to it, which is really interesting. All right, so that's Le Corbusier. So the next piece we're going to look at for architecture is super famous. Well, this one isn't, but the next one we are going to look at is. But the artist, the architect certainly is famous. Sorry, this is the Frederick C. Roby House in Chicago, designed by famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And he was certainly an amazing innovator in this era of early modern architecture. Believe it or not, this incredible, really contemporary-looking house was designed and built in 1906. Isn't that amazing? Frank Lloyd Wright specialized in domestic architecture, homes. He did make some other things. He made some churches, some school buildings, and a few very notable museums. But he preferred, and he really specialized in building homes. And his interest and genius lied in the integration of structure with its surroundings, which is kind of interesting. So for instance, let's take a look at the Roby House here. The Roby House is in Chicago. And I want you to think a little bit about where Chicago is. And if you're thinking Illinois, that's correct. And where is Illinois in our country? And if you're thinking, oh yeah, that's in the Midwest. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the Midwest is a huge expanse of land in the middle of the country, which is really flat. It's real farmland, right? They call this the breadbasket of the United States. It's super, super flat. Lots of workable farmland. And Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to make this house, the Roby House, relate to that flat landscape. And you can see that he used all these really awesome horizontal levels to kind of create this idea of this big flat open prairie. So this was a hallmark of his style. All right. And this is an initial drawing for the house that's on the AP, and arguably his most famous house, which is called Falling Water, or the Edgar Kaufman House. And this one was created in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. And so this was an initial sketch for the house. And this right here is meant to be waterfalls, right? So falling water. And you can see that the house was designed to be built right on top of this creek that actually had water running right underneath the house. And here is a picture of it in the winter built. And here is one of it in this looks like maybe late fall after the leaves have fallen. And so his architectural drawing of the house over the fall absolutely took place. All right, let's go back to this one. So this remarkable home was created by Frank Lloyd Wright during the 1930s. And of course, if you remember back to when that is, the 30s was after the World War I, but before World War II, and it was right at the collapse of the U.S. financial markets, the great stock market crash, actually, and this was a horrible time, obviously, to be building anything, because all these people who had money to build were losing their shirts. Lots and lots of projects that were begun in the 1920s were abandoned in the middle of their build. But this home, built during this really, really difficult financial time in our history, was actually a turning point for Frank Lloyd Wright. He was he did manage to complete the building, and luckily his patron, the Kaufmans, were able to finance it and allow that to happen. And it's interesting. He was criticized for not being modern enough compared to his European counterparts like Le Corbusier. But in the middle of all of this, when he got when he got this contract to build this house, he was really able to show that not only was he modern enough, he was more forward thinking, he was more modern, and he was working with the other architectural ideas than other architects could even dream of. So Falling Water was meant to be a weekend home, a getaway home for the Kaufmans, and the original proposed site was going to be across this waterfall so that the house would have a view of this waterfall on this land that they owned. But Wright thought, now, you know what would really be cool is to put the house right over the waterfall, which was really unusual. And I don't think that could happen today because of we are much more conservative in the way we treat the natural landscape these days, and there are many more building restrictions. I'm sure we would not allow buildings such as this, but at the time, it was really, really innovative. It was really, it was a really daring piece of architectural decision making. Okay, so here's the question I have for you, and you can use this slide, and you can also use this slide as you answer this question. Here's the layout on the ground and the horizon. So these two slides are going to be our best bet. So this slide and this slide to answer the question. I want you to answer me this. He obviously integrated the house into the landscape by building right over the waterfall, but that's not the only way he integrated the house. He integrated the house in a whole bunch of ways. And I want you to look at the design of the house, the materials of the house, the shape of the house, and I want you to tell me all the ways that Frank Lloyd Wright integrated this house into that landscape. And this picture of the house in the winter is a really, really good way to see it. So materials, shape, everything. I want you to think about all the ways that he integrated the house into the landscape. And I also want you to go to the interior spaces. Here we go. And tell me how we integrated the interior spaces also into the landscape. So here's a bunch of the interior spaces. Really, really beautiful. How did he integrate the exterior and the interior right into the landscape? All right. So that's going to be your question for this. One of the other things that I want to just stop and pause really quickly. This is a site drawing that shows you the landscape and where the house sits on the site, and it gives a really good idea of how it fit into the stream that went through it and the surrounding landscape. And this was all an important part of it. Here's another really great. This one's actually a little bit clearer. So you can see here, you can see the river running through, you can see the house here. You can see also that the garage was way back here, and that he had another whole guest wing back up and behind. So the whole site was really integrated well into the natural environment in such a way that it blended rather than really stuck out, but it also had this really amazing style. All right, and Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, goes on to build quite a few other buildings, but I'm not going to take time right now to go into that. This last building is a tumble that he built for Unity College in Salt Lake City. I think it's Unity Temple. It might be actually for the University of Utah in Salt Lake. And again, very modern, again, using all his levels, but kind of going back to almost a Egyptian style. All right, The very last piece we're going to look at in this architecture, and this is going to wrap us up for 20th century architecture, except for one more piece at the very tail end, is this one. And wow, it seems like we really jumped way forward, right? Well, we didn't go that far forward when you think about it, because actually Falling Water was made in the 1930s, right? And this one, believe it or not, this is the Seagram building in New York City. It was designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. This was made in the 1950s. Isn't that amazing? So that's like what, 70 years ago. It's really old now. But it looks still so incredibly modern. It's really impressive. So this is the quintessential skyscraper. Mies van der Rohe was originally a Bauhaus designer, and actually, if you might remember his name, because in part of the reading earlier, there was a section on early Mies van der Rohe design when he was working for the Bauhaus. I didn't assign that reading, but if you read it, you'll see his name there. He was a designer and an architect, remember, the goal of the Bauhaus was to create this clean industrial design that was accessible to all people. That was a real democratic form, and he coined this term: less is more. Less is more. So this idea of this cool, clean, crisp architecture that's super modern, not very detailed, not very decorative, very simple. This building was an office building, and it was his first opportunity to build anything like this. And being a German, to be able to build here in the U.S., that was a real opportunity. Interesting. This was a really international project. The company was Seagram, which you guys might know, and you're correct if you think it's the alcohol company. It was the alcohol company, which is actually a Canadian company. But they wanted their headquarters to be in New York City and Manhattan, right in the very middle of the most, the busiest business district in Manhattan. And they wanted it to have both the connection and the prestige of being in the middle of the universe. 1950s, the world, the center of the world, the center of the business world, the center of the art world, the center of the world was in New York at that time, which is really interesting. So it was after World War II. Europe was still something of a mess as it was recovering from World War II, and the United States had risen as a global power, and New York City had risen as the center of that global power. It was very well located, and it had neighbors across the street like the Lever Building and some other really modern buildings. But he wanted to create a modern building, a contemporary building that would fit in, but would also stand out. And the way that he did this was to create this curtain wall of glass, and to use this smoked amber glass over this anodized steel frame, and the anodized steel, this dark steel frame. So it had this really sharp, kind of almost black look to it. So it was steel, but the exterior also had bronze appointment on it. The video on Khan Academy suggests that it's somewhat classical. And you might wonder, well, how is it classical? Okay, here we go. I'm going to take us back to the Villa Savoye. And I mentioned that Le Corbusier also wanted his building to be classical. And you guys might think this is a bit of a reach. And it maybe is a little bit of a reach. But the Seagram building has that same kind of classical underpinning, and I'm using that word a little bit facetiously, but true, as the Villa Savoye, which is it has the pillars. And just like the Villa Savoye does, it's kind of elevated up on this pillared base, which he felt was kind of modern in its, kind of classical in its inception. there's the columns on the bottom. Let's see if I can get a better, if I've got a closer picture. I think I do. Here's a model. Here's the site plan. Here's a picture up, picture at night. Yeah, and here we go. Now we're looking closer at the bottom. Here are these pillars. You can see that they're fluted. And that was, again, to evoke this kind of classical, this classical shape. And you can see by looking at the way the people are dressed underneath this building that this is the era of this building. It's really old. It just doesn't look like it. The other thing he thought was very classical about this building, just like Le Corbusier did, was that it was very harmonious in its proportions. It was massive, but it was sleek and very geometric. It's very tall. It has a very vertical orientation, and he thought that it looked heroic, masculine, a little bit like the massive corporations that would fill inside of them. And if any of you have ever seen Mad Men, yeah, this is that era. Really masculine time. Okay, so I'm backed us up to this slide of the Seagram building, and I want you to notice something. You'll know it's a really tall building, but you'll notice that even though it has a park that takes a big percentage of the block right in front of it, that they didn't fill the whole building they didn't put building into the whole space that they owned. Why? So that's my question to you about the Seagram building. Why did they do that? And why did the Seagram people agree to that? Because as you know, in New York, this kind of square footage is at an incredible premium. So why did they leave a big space out in front of the building? What was the purpose of that? All right. Sorry. All right. So why did they leave the space? And why did they make that dark, sleek color? What were they hoping to make it look? What was the point of that dark coloring? And one more question. Why the space? Why the coloring? And were there any other decorative items? And you might have to scour this PowerPoint to really find them, but there are a few more decorative items in this building. It's a little bit hard to find, but they're there. Let's see if I can get a better daytime shot. There we go. Yeah, this photograph might help you find them. And this one also might help you find them. So what else is decorative? Look at this facade here. There's another decorative element here. So space in front of the building, the coloring of the building, and other decorative item. All right, and so the one criticism about buildings such as this is that it was like a large glass box and it looked really antiseptic. And there might be people who argue against that. I think there's some arguments to be made about this building not looking terribly antiseptic. Although this was built early, and many that followed and copied these guys, that this style definitely got way overused, and many of our cities, both in all parts of the world, have a lot of buildings that look like this, and so one could argue that they're a little bit overused at this point. Okay, that's the end of this video for Wednesday the 29th. This material will be in the class discussion for our synchronous period, and I look forward to talking with you about it.